Welcome everyone. This is Doug McCall from the International School Health Network. I'm pleased to welcome everybody to this session on behavior theories related to health and personal and social development. I'm pleased to introduce Dan Leach, who is an associate professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada, who is a co-chair of this process with me and others. We have three parts of this, what we've called generally a working group. There is a FRESH working group that is reporting back to the FRESH Partnership, a coalition of UN agencies and donor organizations and global organizations. There is a international research network sponsored by the World Education Research Association, and there is in the development a consortium of education and other faculties sponsored by the Global Network on Deans of Education. So that's sort of the bit of the introduction to the session. What we're here is more detail on those three mechanisms that are working together, and we're looking at the health and personal social development of education within a broader framework of health promoting schools or social development through schools. That is a focus of the attention of many folks around the table. A particularly interesting piece that Paula was directly involved in, or is directly involved in, is a project on preventing violent extremism, which has been funded by Public Safety Canada. And this is looking at a multi-intervention social inclusion approach that can prevent violent extremism. And I think you'll find that the theories that we're going to be looking at today are going to be specifically or quite relevant to that activity, as well as the broader activities noted above, the three groups. Here is a very quick look at the scope of what we call health and personal social development education. The students are at the center. The core subjects, if you like, are around the inner core. The colored chunks are the UN goals, and they also reflect the different aspects of life, hunger and poverty, and education and health, and so on as you go around the table. And then the last circle is the different elements of co-curricular and extracurricular activities that can also promote health and personal and social development education. There is a scoping paper that the working group has developed, and you can find it at that link or on the page that you'll see at the end of the presentation. The working group is looking at various learning behavior models, as we've called them, and so there are three groupings: literacy in health and security and safety, life skills, and social inclusion. And you can see the many different behavioral learning models that are there, or topics that relate to those three groupings. They overlap, and so it's not necessarily there's not an exclusivity between the groups, but I think you'll see the wide range. And this slide shows in orange font or red font the papers that are being developed in the webinars that we've either had or plan to have in the near future. And so it's quite a broad project. We've been able to engage over 80 individuals and organizations in conversations much like this, where we take a specific topic, such as behavior theories, and look at it, discuss it, record it, and do a concept paper, and then it is rolled up into a broader report for the working group. And that report will also form the basis of a research agenda for the International Research Network that Dan chairs, and for teacher development under the Global Network of Deans of Education, that particular consortium. So it's a very broad scope, and we're trying to break it down into smaller bits and then roll them back up. It's fascinating. All of us, I think, are learning a lot from the different work that's being done by the 80 members of the group that's been gathered. We don't meet together very often, but we do learn from each other through the recordings and the sessions. The behavior theories, which is start to turn to the topic of this particular webinar, underlie all these different, what we call multi-component approaches to health and development. The UN agencies have, on the left, you can see the various titles. There's the school health and feeding, child-friendly schools, health promoting schools, and a variety of other multi-component approaches, and these are published frameworks or published components approaches that the UN agencies all use. There's 16 of them in all, and on the right-hand side you'll see the many different component approaches published by various international organizations. So there's lots of different variations on the theme of doing multiple components to promote health and personal and social development. In a similar vein, there are a number of the behavioral theories that we'll talk about today underline various multi-intervention programs on specific topics. And so here's our 3 lists. Again, I'm not going to go through them, but you can see that there's so much of content in terms of how things can be organized into multi-intervention programs addressing specific topics or specific populations or specific aspects of educational access or success. It's a broad frame, but it's important to get that context. So these behavioral theories, which you should see on your screen right now, all underlie all of these interventions and these approaches, and can be used to inform, guide, and assess how we're making progress, not only on those approaches and interventions, but also on specific interventions. And you can see the list of behavior theories that we've brought together for this particular session. We won't be dealing with all of them. We're just going to deal with the last 2, self-determination and moral disengagement. But you can see that there's a wide variety of behavioral theories that can inform and guide our work. We're asking in these discussions, in concept notes, for leaders in those various models and behavior theories to do these 4 things: to define or describe the idea, the concept, to describe how the model has been used in HBSD education, in and across other subjects, and in extracurricular and co-curricular activities, and so on, and then to develop a hypothesis of what are the minimum student learning outputs that can be achieved in different contexts: low resource, high resource, and conflict affected context. That's probably going to be mission impossible, because it's most of the work that's been done in health and personal and social development education has been focused on topics from an optimal perspective rather than from a minimal perspective. What can be achieved by all students given the capacity of the system to teach or to promote in the school setting. And so that's the work that will be done primarily by the International Research Network, is to develop these hypotheses further. And so we're asking authors of papers and presenters in webinars to think about that and to present hypotheses of how we could proceed from here. And then the last component of looking at what the knowledge and beliefs and awareness of teachers and other school-based or school-linked workers can be is related to the model or the theory that we're under examination. So that's sort of the very quickly a little bit of introduction to our work, and we're now going to turn our attention to 2 theories: self-determination theory being first, and then moral disengagement theory being second. And Dan, I'd ask you to take over, and I'll be happy to move the slides as we move forward.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for that introduction. And thanks for the opportunity to talk to folks about self-determination theory. My interest in self-determination theory has evolved over a number of decades, but it forms around kind of 4 key questions I've had about our practices as educators. And I come to this from a perspective of somebody who's really interested in 2 things: research use. So how can we use research to improve our practice, and how can we use research to improve policies that guide our practice? The questions are focused on understanding why we do what we do as educators. As policymakers and as teachers, how can we help people do what they do better? And how can we help people be mindful of the choices they're making? So when we take action, those actions are being taken because we've chosen to take those actions. How can we make sure that we're being mindful in those activities? And then how can we strengthen the intentionality in our actions? And so when I was looking at how to answer those questions, I ran into self-determination theory and see that it helps us really understand the motivation behind why we do what we do. And we can then use that to help people do what they do better, better understand their choices, and therefore strengthen the intentionality of their actions. Looking at the next slide, why use a self-determination based approach? I ran into a lot of this, or I first entered, I guess, this conversation in two places. One, in my basic teacher preparation way back in the 80s, when we were looking at student motivation, and we talked about behaviorism, rewards and punishments, and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Completely put that behind me as I went on into my teaching career, but came back to it again when I was doing some policy work in the U.S. Around teacher improvement, and in particular around the use of test scores to stimulate improvement in education. And ran across an article by the founders of self-determination theory, talking about the challenges with legislating competence in students and teachers. And it was a critique of the whole high-stakes testing movement and its basis in operant psychology. In other words, you can motivate changes in outcomes on standardized tests by rewarding or sanctioning people who are controlled by those tests. So we might look at the issue of merit pay in education as a way to leverage changes in teaching practice by rewarding teachers with higher salaries, or sanctions by punishing them with either lower salaries or perhaps putting their jobs at risk or closing schools. And this is kind of the model that we saw being played out through No Child Left Behind in the United States. While these kinds of leveraged policies can indeed change the practices that people engage in, SDT really explains and highlights why when you do that, you're going to get improvements that are only short-term, fall apart in the long term, and why you get a lot of unintended consequences. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Before we move on too far, so we can go to the next slide, I want to give you a real brief overview of what self-determination theory is, what it says, how it operates. And while it's concerned with motivation, it really is a broader theory around wellness and what happens or how our lives can be conceptualized, how we conceptualize our lives or experience our lives, and develop a sense of well-being. It's focused around three basic psychological needs: the need for autonomy, which is defined as kind of self-sufficiency, empowerment, a feeling of volition in ourselves; competence, our own ability to exercise or expand or express our capacities and talents; and finally, relatedness, and that is having a sense of belonging. So these are the three basic psychological needs identified within the theory. And we find that experiences that enhance these needs lead to greater well-being, while experiences that don't or otherwise add barriers to these needs lead to greater ill-being. And the really important thing for me, the really exciting thing for me when looking at self-determination theory, is that it's a theory that's based on empirical research. The research has been done in laboratory settings. It's been done in practical settings. So it's exciting to me to have a theory that actually has research evidence behind it, rather than just a philosophical theory that is reasoned out logically. So it's both something that is reasoned out logically, but then proven in clinical studies. Moving on to the next slide, those three basic psychological needs are affected by what we call mini-theories, 6 research-informed mini-theories. And I'll quickly go through these to give you a sense of the depth and the breadth and the complexity of what self-determination theory is. Cognitive evaluation theory is really what's concerned with the intrinsic or extrinsic component of our motivation. So it looks at the factors that support or undermine our intrinsic motivation, and it talks about two things: internally perceived locus of control or externally perceived locus of control. So do I feel empowered to take action myself? If so, I'm likely to be intrinsically motivated and have an internal perceived locus of control. Or do I feel constrained in what I have the option to do? Am I being controlled or guided by external forces? In that case, I would have an external perceived locus of control. So as a teacher, thinking about my practice in the classroom, do I get to choose the activities that my students are going to be engaged in? Do I have a role in choosing the curriculum that I'm going to use? Do I have control over what is happening in my classroom, or is it highly regulated? Am I mandated to teach a particular curriculum? Do I have to teach in a particular way? So how empowered am I to be a professional educator? Organismic integration theory. This is where we conceptualize on a continuum kind of four types of motivational regulation. So external, introjected, identified, and integrated. And this really is a continuum that starts at the external, highly controlled side, and then gives us a path to lead to a more intrinsic and integrated sense of motivation. And one of the things that is really interesting about self-determination theory is it creates a roadmap for taking external values of communities or organizations and theorizing a process for internalizing those values. So if we think about the values that we have our values for a reason, and that reason may be rested in the values of an organization. It may be rested in the values and beliefs of our society or our community. But at some time, we have experienced what those values, what those beliefs, what those tendencies are. We've understood them, we've engaged in them, and we've gone through a process where at the end of the day, if we are intrinsically motivated to do those things, we have integrated those external standards into our own identity and our own motivation to act. And so when we have work to do, such as around advancing HPSD in schools, we can conceptualize a way of talking about HPSD issues and working with participants in understanding and learning and engaging in those values and making them a part of themselves. So at the end of the day, we go from an external standard to a much more internal value system where we're highly motivated to engage in the change process. Causality orientation theory shifts the focus from this kind of societal engagement to the individual and helps us understand how individual tendencies to approach experiences, how we approach these experiences from either autonomous, controlled, or amotivated perspectives. Basic psychological needs theory, again, goes back to what I was talking about initially, that when our basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness are satisfied, we generally experience more energy, vigor, vitality. Our anxiety is reduced, and essentially we can talk about a greater sense of wellness and satisfaction. Goal contents theory, again, is a component that looks at how our own life goals and their link to intrinsic or extrinsic sources are related to our wellness. So, for example, if I'm highly motivated to earn a lot of money, if I want to be famous, those are very extrinsic sources of motivation. And what we tend to find is people who are highly extrinsically focused generally feel a lower degree of wellness. Whereas if my goals are to live a good life, to be a a part of a valuable community and experience a sense of relatedness within that community. If I feel empowered to do things that I love, then I'm going to experience a much greater sense of wellness. And then finally, relationships motivation theory recognizes that the same three psychological needs that support our well-being are also necessary components of the relationships we're engaged in. It's less applicable to the kind of thing that we're talking about today, but in our relationships, do we have a sense of autonomy? Do I have a sense of being a equal partner in my relationships? Do I feel competent in my relationship with my significant others? And do we feel a sense of relatedness? If so, our relationships are going to be much stronger. So moving on to the next slide. What does this mean if we think about applying self-determination theory within education? And I'll walk us through here some thinking I was doing around communities of practice or learning communities, and trying to understand in British Columbia here, there was a great interest a few years back in advancing communities of practice that really seemed to go awry. A lot of school districts were very interested in communities of practice and establishing these communities of practice to build change, and it didn't seem to work out the way people planned, and I was interested in why that was happening. And so when I looked at it from a self-determination perspective of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, I began to see some things that were playing out. So if you look at the theories of community practice, it aligns communities of practice. It aligns quite well with self-determination theory. If you look at how it advances autonomy, you can see communities of practice being something that would really strengthen professional judgment and practice through application of research and data to inform actions in areas of practice. So if I have a community of practice, we're going to say, hey, what's going on in our community? How can we strengthen and improve the experience and the activities of people within our community? We may go to the research and see what research would guide, how research would guide us in addressing the problems that we're identifying. And as a community, we've come to some agreement on a change process. And if done in that way, you can see how this would really maximize our autonomy as practitioners. But the way school districts were implementing this was much more controlled. And so we saw autonomy being affected by school districts who wanted to control teacher practice by using research and data to direct what they do. So for example, we are going to have a community of practice or a learning community on implementing no zeros policies. So it wasn't something along the lines of what should we do to reform our grading structure. Instead, it was how are you going to implement this no zeros policy that we're mandating. And so in that kind of sense, it became much more of a control mechanism rather than something to strengthen autonomy. When we look at competence, you can see again how if we engage the community in learning about what mechanisms they might use, what activities they might use to implement change, if we support teachers in their skill development through professional learning or other approaches to helping them address their self-identified needs, you can see how that would build their sense of competence. If instead we use the program to control skill development through targeted workshops that are aligned with district policies, then you can see how that might be much more controlling and not so empowering. When we think about relatedness, again, we have a community of practitioners who are working together to address the needs that community identifies. It can be very supportive from a self-determination theory perspective, or we can use it to control teacher communities by directing change in response to particular district policies or ministry mandates, such as implementing a directed reading program. So you can really begin to see how the way in which we implement particular reforms either supports us as professionals or controls us. And if it tends to control us, then we're going to experience some unintended consequences and the system and the participants in that system may be rebelling from or resisting that amount of control. So moving on to the next slide, if we were looking at how we have how the particular mini theories play out in this kind of environment, you can see from cognitive evaluation theory how we would want to be supporting teachers in self-selected research-based professional development that builds their internal perceived locus of control, rather than controlling teachers in required research-based or other kinds of development that is mandated from the central office. When we think about organismic integration theory, we would strengthen integration of community values around change through research and knowledge acquisition, through communal discussion and identification of priorities, and really a consensus building process of what we need to do. We can begin to see how we can internalize what may start as an external exploration of issues, or we can think about from a more negative perspective how we control community standards through external rewards and sanctions, such as shaming or guilt, or increased rewards of some sort that then drive our behavior rather than help us actually see the value of those behaviors for the community itself. If we think about causality orientations theory, we really want to be talking about strengthening our opportunities for building individual volition, choice, and autonomy, as opposed to controlling individual actions within defined community parameters. All of this leads to our sense of well-being within the community. So if we think about it again from the basic psychological needs perspective, how can we strengthen community wellness and activity through empowering these three basic needs for autonomy, for competence, and for relatedness, empowering teachers and educators to make the choices within their practice, helping them feel competent in implementing those choices, and then doing so as part of a broader community that is engaged in the change process, as opposed to weakening community wellness by controlling and guiding individual and communal behaviors or values. And then finally, thinking about goal contents theory, how can we strengthen communities by supporting personal and community directed growth versus controlling them through extrinsic rewards, such as the use of blue ribbon schools or achievement report cards or other kinds of measurements. Moving on to the next slide. Before I get into the details of that slide, and I've tweaked that slide a little bit, so I've got a different bit of content that I'm going to be talking about. One of the real key things to understand within self-determination theory is that when individuals feel a great sense of control, when they don't feel a lot of autonomy in what they're able to do, they struggle. And they struggle to retain and exercise their autonomy. And so when we see really strong extrinsic controls that are attached to specific outcomes that we want, for example, particular behaviors within the community or in the education context, changing, increasing achievement on standardized tests in the medical sciences or hospital profession, the idea of reducing death rates in hospitals. If we attach particular policy initiatives to these kinds of measurable outcomes, what will happen is that the outcomes will become the priority, and how we achieve those outcomes will be less important. And so what you'll see is the people within the system will frequently engage in what we would consider inappropriate, unethical, or at best unhelpful behaviors, because they are being so strongly incentivized to reach those particular outcomes. And that's how we get at the sense of unintended consequences to policies that are mandated or laid over particular systems. And so what you want to make sure you do when you think about policies that would advance HPSD is not how can we leverage systems to make change, or how can we leverage individuals to behave in particular ways, but how can we support individuals in internalizing the values that we see so clearly in HPSD. So from a policy perspective, really what we want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about policy, practice, and learning. And I'll send this slide to folks so we can update the PowerPoint. We really want to talk about policy. From policy perspective, policies should be designed to support the action of practitioners and community members and organizations, and not control them. We really need to make sure that the policies are created to empower sites to choose to participate, and to choose how to participate from the strategic use, for example, of funding or other kinds of resources that we can make available. But that component of choice is really important if we want to make sure that we get buy-in from these organizations and communities within the values of HPSD. When we think about how we help people change their practice, we really want to make sure that we're, again, engaging practitioners so that they can identify community needs within their environment, and then target how best to leverage resources to address those needs. So really provide professional development resources to help practitioners engage in the change process. And then finally, obviously the goal should be to go from policy to changes in practice with implications for learning. The desire we need to make sure that we engage students and communities in learning about HPSD and internalizing the importance of healthy behaviors, rather than just simply learning the indicators of healthy behaviors and being able to report those out and say things like, I should wash my hands, or those kinds of very symbolic and knowledge-oriented changes. Instead, what we really want to do is make sure that students and communities are able to internalize the importance of these healthy behaviors, so that they want to engage in those behaviors of their own volition, and not because they know they should, or they feel that we're telling them that they must. And now I'll turn it back to Doug and allow him to talk about more of disengagement theory, but I look forward to questions and engaging in more discussion at the end of the presentation. So thanks for your time.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dan. And we'll come back to this slide perhaps at the discussion piece. These are some of the ideas that we identified as we talked about SDT theory and some of the implications for what we know about health and life skills education and teaching. But we'll come back to these as part of our discussion at the end, or to additional ideas as well. I'm just going to find my cursor here. Here it is. So moral disengagement theory is I think, a really powerful tool to understand antisocial behaviors and violence, and preventing extreme views and violent extremism. And it's a theory that was developed by Bandura, who is originally, I guess, taught at UBC and has moved on to Stanford and is now retired. But his work was pretty landmark in nature, and this is the way he summarized it. And it's really powerful if you begin to think this as a bit of a lens for examining social development in particular, but social inclusion and preventing violence and violent extremism. And here's a little diagram that I came across, and as we've collected materials, it's a way of describing that process of becoming morally disengaged, and how we all excuse our own behaviors to ourselves in a way through those kinds of justifications or self-justifications. It's a really fascinating way of understanding behavior and our psychology, and so it's powerful. I think we can look at how we go through some of those steps in a variety of ways, and of course within organizations, it's the chopping up of responsibility or diffusion of responsibility that is often used to not be able to achieve what could be more important goals or objectives. The implications and applications to health and personal and social development education are quite direct in terms of the subjects that we normally think about in terms of health and personal and social development. in health education, home economics, or in personal and social development, or in phys ed, you can see that it's often included in the stated objectives for those. That in health education, there'll often be an objective that we're going to be concerned about the health of others. In home economics, it's more about consumer education and honesty in advertising, and being able to purchase goods based on honest explanations of their value. In personal and social development education and in life skills, it's the concept of honest and caring relationships, which is woven throughout that kind of approach, or that scope. And then in physical activity, it's fair play, being able to compete honestly and fairly in sports and activities. But if you actually look at the reports on those topics or those subjects, these aspects are rarely, if ever, studied or reported as part of the reporting out of what's being achieved in those curricula. And so it's a forgotten area for each of those areas, and I think it reflects, I think, the need to rethink what we're actually aiming at in those different programs of study. Moral engagement or disengagement is also relevant to other subjects, and indeed to schooling overall. And here's a quick list in terms of the social studies, in terms of science education, ethics, in terms of moral and religious education, which are obviously focused on moral engagement. Honesty and character are often included in mission statements and codes of conduct for schools. And then, of course, cheating in exams or applications to higher education is another obviously concern for schools. And so moral disengagement is really central to the moral development, social, or to put it in another way, social control function of schooling. In other words, behaving properly in class. And I guess Susan Sulati was hoping to be here today. I think we might have missed the time zones in getting her to be online today, but her work looked at that and described how moral disengagement can appear in terms of classroom misbehavior or incivility, and how it conflicts with the social responsibility goals or character of junior high school students. And so it's really central to schooling in terms of being able to be properly behaved in school, and to be mindful of others in school, but it's a part of a variety of subject areas as described in this slide. And so what we've learned thus far, and this is a process that's underway, and we'll be engaging Susan and others who are more expert in moral disengagement and probably moral engagement, is what we found thus far. And it's really interesting as you read through it that moral disengagement has been quite explored and explained in individual or psychological terms. It can be understood as a correlate, a cause, a mediator, a result of experiences and conditions and interactions between individuals and family or social conditions. There's scales have been developed within individuals to measure it. There have been correlations with the different antisocial behaviors such as bullying or violence. And so there's a variety of depth in terms of there's a lot of depth in terms of how disengagement has been explained and explored. And then obviously on the opposite side, there's the different scales and understanding with individuals about moral development and social responsibility and empathy. So it's a well explained concept in psychology. It's also been, what we found thus far is it's been correlated with several antisocial behaviors, including classroom misbehavior, academic cheating, bullying, cyberbullying, violence, extremism, and violent extremism. So it's people have looked at those behaviors and looked at how moral disengagement can be both a cause and effect, and not only within the perpetrator, but also in terms of how bystanders respond to those behaviors as well, and victims as well. So it's again been well explained in a variety of different ways through a number of different studies. So one area that I think is really important that we need to think about, and it shows up in our work within the PVE project we're doing with Public Safety Canada, is how social media and reality TV need to be understood as being very risky venues or virtual environments that we need to think about. So that we need to understand how young people are growing up in a world where social media and reality television are much more prominent than they were when perhaps some of us at this session were, and so they need to be better understood as major factors in promoting or preventing moral engagement or actually being a cause of moral disengagement. And then also the other factor, and again it's well stated in many other publications, the decline of what I've called here moral guardians, the churches, parents being able to supervise their kids closely at home during the day, community norms, education authority, education as having educators as having authority over children for their moral behaviors is another. It's a real decline of those kinds of safeguards or guardians, and so we need to understand that social context in which we're operating and the kids are growing up in. And then the last bullet there, there is a collective, what the authors have called a collective scale of moral disengagement for adolescents. It's been developed and validated, validated twice in that sentence, but validated for different cultural contexts, and the references there. But there are several references of taking that scale and adapting it to different countries and to different issues. So we do have some way of measuring moral disengagement, and there are likely to be ways of measuring and collectively measuring and monitoring the positive side of moral engagement or moral development. So here are the kind of the practical questions. Can we use moral engagement or moral disengagement to guide or assess or inform curriculum and classroom management practices? And from what we found thus far, it looks like the research is young. There's a couple of citations here I put into this slide, but there is evidence to show that teachers can modify their classroom management practices to be able to respond to classroom incivilities, and moral disengagement theory can be very helpful in providing guidance and also for assessing the effect of that. And then there are some instructional activities that or focus points that can be used to also develop moral engagement or to prevent moral disengagement. And critical thinking, persuasion, reflective journalism, and a number of others are there. We haven't had a chance to really look at the research for moral and religious education or character education or social responsibility or empathy and critical thinking, but I'm estimating that we're going to find studies if we use those search words rather than moral disengagement, and so we should be able to flesh out a number of studies. I'm not sure there'll be that many reviews, research reviews, but we'll be able to look at intervention studies that looked at different interventions from a point of view of classroom practice, either teaching or classroom management practices. So that'll be developed further in the concept note that we're developing for this topic. And then looking more broadly within the school, can we modify school routines and offer extended educational opportunities in the school day or activities that are linked to the family or community or online activities to either promote moral engagement or prevent moral disengagement? And we haven't had a chance to look at the interventions, but there's going to be, I assume that there's going to be pockets of intervention research showing impact of these kinds of extended educational interventions on moral engagement or disengagement. And there'll be, I'm sure, bodies of knowledge related to student codes of conduct and school discipline, on pastoral counseling, on the practice, the school practice of sending home little mini report cards when students are caught doing good things. All of us have seen those with our kids and grandkids. Grouping students so that younger students are not interacting extensively with older students in negative ways, or student buddy programs or older students mentor younger students. And I'm sure there's more interventions that we'll be able to identify. And what we'll be trying to look at is whether moral engagement or moral disengagement is measured or monitored in those kinds of interventions, and be able to report back in terms of whether this has been a factor in informing and guiding those interventions. One of the challenges for the International Research Network and for the Fresh Work Group is trying to define some universally achievable student learning outputs that can be realistically taught or promoted in schools. Our challenge as a work group, as overall, has been that almost all of the work in health and personal and social development education has been driven by specific topics, and so we need to think about. Those topics are looked at from an optimal point of view. How much can students learn or be encouraged to learn through informal activities about that particular topic? And of course, that ends up being a massive amount of content that is just not achievable in the school day or in the classroom, limited classroom time we have for social and personal and social development. And so we need to think about how we can measure and identify the minimal kinds of outputs. And so these are kind of what we found thus far. That moral disengagement or engagement is going to be context dependent and is going to be mediated by local and community and family individual characteristics. The different applications of moral disengagement or moral engagement will likely also focus on antisocial or pro-social behaviors, such as bullying or cyberbullying or classroom incivility or whatever. And so generalizing from those bodies of knowledge, those likely siloed bodies of knowledge, might be difficult. Another area of investigation I think would be very interesting is whole school models that include moral development or moral disengagement or engagement as one of their primary focuses. So we have alternative schools for troubled students, we have individual education programs for students in difficulty with the law, we have religious schools, we have indigenous schools, and so on. What is the net of the overall effect of those whole school approaches? Now, some of that may be controversial, but in Canada, where I'm Canadian, and 40% of the schools in Canada are religious based. But we've never really compared religious schools, that 40% of religious schools compared to the public schools in Canada in terms of some of the social outcomes. And that would be, I'm sure, controversial, but it also might be quite informative in terms of, is the mission of the school having an impact on the overall behavior or moral development of children, or even in those less controversial things in terms of alternative schools. And then, of course, the components of a whole school approach, the instructional content, the classroom management, school discipline, and ethos, teacher beliefs and readiness, and so on, all those things will all be variables that will need to be examined and studied in research. And then being able to define realistic outputs or even norms or acceptable standards for schools may be possible, but it's going to be, despite public stated goals about developing student characters and morals and reporting, even on the collective student body, may be controversial. We often default to monitoring incidents of negative things such as violence or bullying or suspensions, rather than monitoring the overall moral engagement of students. So that's kind of looking at how we might proceed in the future and trying to look at how the research network could develop a bit of a research agenda around moral engagement or disengagement. And then we have in our working group asked our authors and our presenters to look at these broad challenges facing students today. And obviously alienation and violence and extremism is a really important part of the challenge, and is going to be a major focus for, or should be a major focus for, moral disengagement theory. But the others will have some implications as well. So I'll stop here and give us a chance to talk about both theories, the SDT and MD, and ask for questions or comments, either just by clicking on your mic or typing into the microphone. And Dan, if you wanted to jump in right away with some thoughts and questions, that'd be great.
Oui, bonjour, c'est Paula.
Hi Paula, bonjour.
Est-ce que je peux parler en français puis que tu traduises pour les autres
Oui,
personnes qui sont là?
Oui, certainement, oui.
Si, je trouve très intéressant l'angle par lequel la discussion est amenée, des ancrages très forts au niveau psychologique, au niveau développemental. J'adhère tout à fait et je me pose la question de la construction identitaire, donc du désengagement moral, le risque du désengagement moral, mais aussi le défi de la construction identitaire dans un contexte où des valeurs qui sont enseignées à l'école, dans la société ou dans la famille. Donc, des fois, des écarts au niveau de la perception, de l'éducation, entre autres, créent des clivages sociaux qu'on voit bien, donc des polarités sociales, mais aussi à l'intérieur des jeunes qui ont à se construire au niveau identitaire.
Okay.
Do you get that?
Yeah, yeah. Just French is always so much clearer.
I can try in English, but
No, it's okay. Well, yeah, let me try. I think Paul has raised the question of how this fits within the construction of a student's identity, and how is it broader, and all the multiple factors that come into that, and this is one insight, that I think, one angle that that is powerful. But how do we explore that further? I don't know, Paula, is that a fair way of expressing?
yeah.
And it's broader than
Like
just the moral piece. Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's a good one. A good question. And I think it also relates to whether people are being motivated intrinsically or extrinsically, and goes into how we separate that out is without having just we can put it all together in a mushy way. But I'm always one who tries to say, well, what does this mean in terms of practice, in terms of teacher practice, or in the area of health and life skills education? What can it mean in terms of changes in what we're trying to do? And so I think it's one lens that has been, I think, maybe unconsciously ignored, the idea of moral engagement. There was a time when schooling was all about socialization, when kids came off the farms and they were loose in the city streets, and they were put into schools, primarily religious schools, primarily religious schools or charitable schools, so that they wouldn't misbehave. That was the primary function of schooling. And now it obviously faded in importance as the Industrial Revolution occurred, and all sorts of things other occurred. But now, as we face sort of, in many ways, a moral crossroads in terms of how we're developing as societies, how do we come back to that so that schools are becoming moral promoting agencies, morals promoting agencies, without imposing specific brands of morality on students or families? And that goes to the identity formation. I think it's really, it goes to them. I don't know if I've responded. Dan, do you want to take a stab at that as well?
Push that perspective a little bit to say that schools still are primarily vehicles for socialization. It's just that we've shifted what we're socializing students into. So we're much more interested now in socializing them in academic behaviors and academic outcomes, rather than thinking about that broader public and social good within schools. And so, yeah, from a self-determination theory, I think perspective would certainly support the idea that schools are still about socializing the community into a particular set of values, and so how do we understand what those values are, and how do we make sure that is what we are working with the community to internalize? So if our values are getting a good job that's high paying, if our values are
good relationships,
well, yeah, exactly. If our values are extrinsic, reward, right, we're going to have I think the sense of moral disengagement is going to be put out there as quite vulnerable if our values and goals are much more around Yes, relatedness, relationships, individual autonomy and competence to engage in their best life, then I think we're going to have a different set of outcomes.
Uh-huh.
So I think we just need to be explicit about what it is that we're trying to do and move away from that very extrinsic motivation to attain great rewards from our studies, and instead think about how we move to becoming valuable members of a healthy community as our goal for education.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Paula or Mary, Mary, do you have, hopefully your mic is working, or that you've not been called away to a meeting in the middle of this meeting. But one question or one relevance here, and it's not for answering today, but I've been invited to sit on an OECD committee on teacher development, on teacher education and development. And they're looking at teacher agency. And the previous work of that group, OECD, it's their Education 2030 work, has been looking at student agency. And I think really self-determination theory is got to be the basis of how they're thinking about that. I'm not sure that has been. I was sent a list of teacher agency questions that have been part of the OECD study of teachers that comes out, or survey of teachers that comes out every 3 or 4 years, TALIS, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but to the extent to which SDT theory has been respected in both those concepts of student agency and teacher agency is a question I think we need to, I certainly will go looking at it too, because it's if it's, again, from an extrinsic point of view, of getting a good education to get a good job, I'm not sure it's going to be as well expressed and understood when we look at student agency and teacher agency. So very, very relevant to the policy discussions going on at that level, and so I think it's going to be useful to pursue. I'm going to go back to the slide that had some other discussions about self-determination theory. There we go. And these were some of the thoughts that came to me when I saw Dan's work and slides, and fundamentally that first one, Dan touched on it, is traditionally health education has been about prescribing specific behaviors that promise some distant health benefits. That if you eat well, and you're not going to be obese when you grow up, and that kind of stuff. And newer models of health education emerging in Europe a few years ago, and actually it's a little bit of an ad here. There's going to be a session on March 18th from a woman who's done life skills education in low resource countries, is that the approach is using student action at their core, student actions and empowerment at the core of the program, which is not about prescribed health behaviors, and often it gives flexibility. They don't have to cover certain health topics, and that's going to be that's a bit of a revolution in traditional health education if it goes that kind of way. And I think self-determination theory can be one of the best arguments and motivators for that new approach. Dan, does that fit with what your understanding of SDT and more broadly going outside of the realm of health and life skills education? Is that really about our approach to education in general?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that makes real good sense, and it's actually really been fascinating for me as I dig into self-determination theory to see all the places where I think people are doing things that align very well with self-determination theory, but not necessarily knowing why. Why, right? That student action is really important. We find that there's a great correlation between when students are engaged and the particular outcomes, but we don't really think about what that operational mechanism is that goes from student engagement to these positive outcomes. And I think SDT definitely gives us a greater understanding of what that mechanism might be.
Okay. And another one that's always struck me, again, it's quite practical and organizational. The health teacher associations, or health and personal and social development teacher associations, are, I think there's only one country, that's the UK, the England actually, not the whole UK. England has a teacher association devoted to personal and social HPSD education. Quebec used to. But as the curriculum changed, there was a very strong association in Quebec that gradually disappeared after the curriculum was changed. And yet, if we're looking at forming relatedness, the strength you get from meeting people who are engaged in the same work that you're doing, it's quite stark, the absence of having those kinds of specialist teacher associations in almost all countries on almost all other subjects, including physical education, but not on health education. It's for me, that means we really do need to try to fill that vacuum, but it's a real challenge because health education or life skills education is often the lowest rung on the totem pole. In terms of career choices and career paths within education. Almost all other kinds of teachers have higher social status within the system. So anyway, I think it's maybe a tangential to SDT theory, but it's for me it was a real reminder of the gap that's there. Dan, do you want to comment?
I would agree. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that anything that we can do, again, to maximize that sense of relatedness and community is going to be, quite positive. And it's interesting to think about why health and PE has gone to the PE side and moved away from the health side of organizations, and what kind of maybe worldview something focused on physical education rather than more broadly on health and personal social development says. But absolutely, the more we can strengthen communities around HPSD, the better we're going to be.
Okay. And then the other, again, it goes to extrinsic motivations. The two last bullets, there are a lot of healthy school award programs or community school award programs or green school award programs. And if they're voluntary, there's very low take-up. Even though the school gets a nice little certificate when they meet certain criteria. Very often, if you look at the numbers of participating, they're less than 4 or 5%, despite the good efforts of funded projects and programs to try to engage and recruit schools into those. But it's because that's an extrinsic reward rather than really growing out of the school's concern for the health and social problems of their kids, of their students. It's a nice little banner thing, but it's not a thing that really changes practices. And same thing for country level. If there are a whole bunch of UN agency self-assessment tools that are not used very often, to be polite. And again, that's because the extrinsic rewards are really not what motivates organizations as well as individuals, I think, unless there's money involved, and then of course they'll do what's required to get the money.
Yeah. Another thing to think about on that too, Doug, is not just money, but the way I like to talk to communities about is it'll help them. Here's something that will help you do what you want to do better, right? And so helping people understand what it is that they want to do. And I think you were quite accurate there in coming to the need for change or the need for work in a particular area on their own, and then seeing that, oh, here is this program, or here is this assessment tool that will help me do that better. Then I think you get people quite engaged in accessing those resources because they're seen as resources, as opposed to, as you were pointing out, you get this nice banner or badge or certificate if you do this thing, very few people are going to be motivated from that perspective of, oh, I'm going to engage in all of this work to get a little certificate. But I will engage in this work because I see the value it would have in strengthening the community I'm a part of.
Yeah, and just to extend the story, the analogy, there's been, in my experience, I'm not, I don't know everything going on in the world, but England and New Zealand had programs, healthy school programs that enabled the local schools or the local school districts to choose the health issues they wanted to address, rather than having them imposed from the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education. And they had really high uptake and participation rates, but the ministries of health in those two countries really were not comfortable with having the lost control of the topics that they needed to address, because that's how they got their rewards, extrinsic rewards within the bureaucracy. And so eventually those two programs were disbanded and then went back to the more traditional mode of choosing topics and then trying to promote their coverage in schools. And it was very disheartening, I think, from well, I know personally with the people involved. I knew both sets of people working in those countries, and they were getting such high rates of participation from educators. And then once it went back to the traditional health topic approach, well, they may get good participation for by other ways, but it certainly was not the engagement of the educators the way they had been doing.
Yeah, about that, I'll try in English, but okay, might take a little time. Here in Quebec, I can more talk about violence prevention. One choice we made was to ask schools to monitor what's going on in their schools, and then act from that point. So it's not coming from the outside, from the ministry, because it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. We don't get into schools if we decide from up there what should be done in their schools. So the schools ont adhéré. They agreed. Like ils ont adhéré. Ils ont commencé à agir from the point where they were help to identify their priorities in their.
Yep.
Okay. So in violence prevention was like that, and we've been able to work with schools from that point. Before it was coming from outside, so it with no meaning for them. Can you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think that fits with self-determination theory. Dan, do you want to? I mean, it really does, and that's walking the talk, really.
Yeah, and another reflection is coming to me is that to the moral development takes time, and okay, I'm switching from the school professional perspective and child development. Okay, I'm switching from one to the other, but while we are thinking about the moral development, les plus jeunes need to be taught. So it has to come from the outside first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then gradually it gets more intrinsic, and so it's from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. So how can we in a school identify what, when and what can be taught, and when it can not normally gets internal? Do you get that?
Yep, that's right. No, and that's it's more clearly seen in the scope and sequence of curricula. Mm-hmm. That you can go from, and the research on moral development is very clear that there is that stages of development from young children into older children and into adolescence and so on, and we can likely do that on an organizational level both in terms of the intended curriculum, providing that kind of map of when more intrinsic motivations can be brought into the teaching and learning. I'm not familiar with anybody who's tried to do that in that way, to use that lens, but that would be it's both combining it's actually combining the two theories we've been talking about today in a way that again, that's the kind of, in my view, applied research that needs to be done and then tested and worked through in different schools in different contexts to be able to say, yes, that really is, I used to teach junior high school level, the kids were and they were troubled kids, behavior problem kids, but at a certain point, they could be trusted to do what they needed to do, and they did it actually better than I, as a teacher, could ever do.
Yeah.
And so, getting that on an organizational level would be challenging, but still very, very helpful, I think. And maybe in terms of health and life skills education, get us away from that. You got to eat your vegetables at a certain age, or whatever. It gets that concern. Dan, do you have any? You want to comment, and then maybe we'll move to closing up. We're about 20 minutes after.
Yeah, to jump in on that. If you think about what schools are, I mean, schools are incredibly extrinsically set up. The curriculum is foisted upon students. Students are then graded, particularly as they get older, on an AF kind of framework, so that why do you need to learn this? You need to learn this so you can get a good grade. Why do you need a good grade? So that you can get a good job. So much of what we do in school is set up around these extrinsic incentives. And so I think you're right in saying that this work comes to students, these values, the content comes to students from an extrinsic perspective. But what we have to do as educators is work with students to understand the value of the particular things that they're learning. So why should English or math or health, personal and social development?
What's behind it? Yeah.
Why is this important? Why will this? Why is this useful for me to internalize and value? Rather than and when we do that, we talk with them about how it will affect them and their lives as a person, as an individual, how it will empower them to be able to make choices that they may not be able to make otherwise, but not define it in terms of you need to do this to get an A, or you need to do this to get a high-paying job.
Totally agree.
Okay. That's very interesting. This has been as usual, a very interesting conversation, and it is being recorded. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll post the revised set of slides on the page that we've noted as well. I'll just skip through to that. I think, Paula, you'll be able to find it, but others, if you go to this page,
yes,
here,
I've noted. Yeah, I've noted.
Then that's and of course, for those of you listening to the recording, Dan and I are both willing to respond and engage you in conversations by email at those two email addresses. So, Dan and Paula, thank you very much for your participation today. I think we've
Thank you very much. And you can be sure I will work with my colleagues on that.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, both.
I'll try as much as I can.
Okay, I'm going to just shut off the recording and